Welcome back to the Bonsai Builders Podcast. I'm your host, Addison. In our pursuit of mastery, we obsess over soil and wire and fertilizer, but the most frequent interaction we have with our trees is actually through water. For most of us, that water comes from a tap produced by a city infrastructure we rarely think about. But today we're going to look inside the pipes. My guest is Eric Forrester, who is one of my oldest childhood friends and actually one of the people that I respect the most. So I'm really excited to have him on the podcast and get a chance to have a conversation with him and gather data from his expertise that kind of crosses over with my passion. So Eric's a chemical engineer, and he's now working at a company that supports many different water treatment applications through their activated carbon solutions. So Eric spends his day thinking about water treatment at a massive scale. So though he isn't a bonsai guy, he understands water, I think, in a way that will provide some unique insights for us in our pursuit of mastery of bonsai. So we're going to do some horticultural kind of problem solving through that lens with Eric today. So Eric, thank you for coming on the show.
Addison, thanks for having me. You flatter me with your description, so I hope I can live up to the expectations, but I'm happy to be here.
So Eric, you work at Calgon Carbon, and you work with a lot of municipal water treatment facilities. Can you kind of give me the 30,000 foot view of like what your company does and like what your role is there?
Yeah. So Calgon Carbon, we're the world's largest manufacturer of granular activated carbon. I mean, we can get more into what activated carbon is specifically a little bit later, maybe. But the large part of it is it's used for pretty much any sort of purification process, from taking brown sugar, removing the color and making it white, to any sort of chemical purification, to water treatment. For municipalities down to your Brita filter, activated carbon is really widely used in a lot of different industries. For water treatment, some of the stuff that we focus on, someone put it to me this way, that municipal water treatment is really focused on, they only really remove three things from water. It's solids and dirt, dissolved organic chemicals, and microorganisms. And pretty much everything that a water treatment plant is interested in removing, it falls into one of those three buckets. And activated carbon primarily is removing those dissolved organic chemicals.
Oh, interesting. Okay. And what's your role at Calgon, or like how has that changed over time?
Yeah, so Calgon Carbon, I got hired as an applications engineer in the drinking water group right out of college. And so what I did then is I kind of helped, if a municipal water plant wanted to remove a particular chemical from their water, they'd come to us and say, our flow rate at our plant is generally this much. We have X amount of this chemical. What would you recommend as a system or treatment solution for us to help solve that problem? And then my job would be to design that system on paper, and then maybe come up with a test plan to test it at the bench or pilot scale, and then take those results, and hopefully they would end up purchasing a system from us. So that was my job for the first maybe 2 or 3 years at the company. And then somebody thought I could speak really well, and so they got me doing presentations and PowerPoints and things. I did a little stint in business development, trying to find new markets for a new manufacturing line that we were building. And for the last 5 years, I've been an account manager with the drinking water group. So more on the kind of logistics and executing the project. Once we have the solution installed and their carbon runs out of usefulness, we'll need to replace it with new carbon. And so I help organize logistics, getting the trucks and the carbon and the people there at the right times to make that happen.
Oh, very cool. I guess to sell effectively and be an account manager, you probably need to understand the customer's domain pretty well, right? So can you tell us a little bit about like what are the priorities for water treatment facilities? Are they optimizing for the drinkability by humans of the water versus for like agricultural applications? Or like what are they trying to do? I mean, I know you pulled out those three components that are the main focus for them, but like why are those components the main focus?
It's definitely about the drinkability for humans, and that's the primary focus. And they're depending on the age of the person, there might be different priorities. Like for certain chemicals, they might say like, oh, if you're an adult, the concentration that's in the water needs to be at or below this level for a particular contaminant. But if the concentration is maybe half that, that might be a trouble for like an infant or a mother who's breastfeeding an infant. And so different local and federal governments will set different standards based on that, and they might have different notification standards. Like, well, adults can still drink this water, but they'll have to send out a notice to say, hey, it's at this minor threshold level. So maybe if you're a breastfeeding mother, you shouldn't be drinking the water for the next 2 weeks.
Oh, wow. Okay.
But the primary goal for the municipal water plan is to make sure that we can drink it safely. And that's what makes kind of the U.S. unique, as far as I know, is that you can go pretty much anywhere in the country and turn on the tap, and it's relatively safe to drink. It's not going to be acutely toxic to you. There's debates and things about different emerging contaminants and what levels they may or may not be safe at. And obviously there's new data that come out all the time that support different conclusions and different new emerging regulations that need to be out there to protect us adequately. But for the most part, if you can go anywhere in the country and turn on the tap, and you're going to be able to drink it pretty safely.
Interesting. So I think something that you just highlighted that stuck out to me was there's different local and federal regulations and state regulations, as well as differences in like where the water is coming from. So it seems like there's a lot of variability. Like, though it's drinkable, there's probably a lot of variability still in tap water and the makeup of it across the U.S. Would you say that's accurate?
Yes, I'd say maybe not in the safety of it, but definitely in the taste, definitely the taste. I know in my particular neck of the woods in Beaver, Pennsylvania, in the town of Beaver in particular, the water is notoriously hard, and just everybody there hates to drink it. It's just it does not taste good, but it's entirely safe to drink. But everyone in that town pretty much has their own point of entry system in their house, some Calgon system to treat the water, some water softening thing to make it easier for them to drink.
Makes sense. What are the main, I guess, contaminants, or what it mainly makes up water in the U.S.?
Well, for me, if I were to get data from a municipality to help start designing a system, some of the things that we would look at would be the total organic carbon content, or TOC. There's also dissolved organic carbon, DOC. Don't quiz me on the difference between those. It's been quite a while. But the total organic carbon content, the TOC, it's a bulk measure of how many organics are in the water. Because it may or may not be an organic contaminant, like a specific one that you can measure. It's a big soup of things, and it may or may not be something that's regulated, but it's kind of a general measure of how much organic load is in the water. And then beyond that, if there are specific chemicals that they know are a problem in their area, like, maybe we're near an airport or some big industrial hub, so we know maybe the groundwater might have traces of volatile organic chemicals, like benzene is just one that comes to mind, something like that. They might have data on that particular chemical. Okay. I know the hot button one right now is PFAS, per and polyfluoral alkyl substances. That's a really big one that people are paying attention to, especially because they are present in concentrations that are very small, parts per trillion concentrations, whereas most of the historical things that we're looking at, like volatile organic compounds, chlorinated solvents, historical industrial contamination, I'd call it, much more present in the part per million or part per billion range. But these are a whole nother few orders of magnitude smaller than that. So it's really an interesting kind of problem where we can barely notice these chemicals, but they might have a profound effect on people, so we have to treat them.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, the first thing that's coming to my mind is even in little amounts, these substances add up over time in humans and can cause critical failures of systems, right? I don't know the effects of all these chemicals, but it's not like if I drink, water with 5 parts per billion benzene in it, I'm going to die immediately, but it's probably not good over time, right? To have these different PFAS or all these different things building up in your system over time. And it sounds and then the analog to that for bonsai is there's probably other, not as much probably the organic components, but more of the pH affecting or the calcium or these different, or salts that can build up in the soil and cause health decline in the tree over time as well in our containerized environment, right? So it's kind of a similar analogous, right? Where there's these things that, as people, we're drinking our tap water every day and those chemicals can affect us. And then for trees, we're watering them every day. And so those chemicals can affect them in a similar way.
That's a really interesting and neat comparison. I like that. And I do want to say, I'm focused, I feel like I'm focusing on the organic chemical side of things, because that was really where my focus was with activated carbon. But obviously pH is a really big part. You can't have, acidic water come into your tap or basic water. It's got to be in a safe range for drinking. So there are many focuses for the water plant that I may be not as well versed in, but I've gotten some exposure to them just through osmosis, if I can make a little pun.
Puns are definitely allowed on this podcast.
All right, good.
Yeah, they're encouraged. So can you talk to me a little bit about, what are these? You gave two good examples, I think, of these like dissolved organic compounds. But is this also things like bacteria, or like what are other, like bringing it home to folks and making it really real, like that might not know what benzene is or something like that?
Mm-hmm.
Like what are like common names that we might be associated with that they're trying to get out of water?
Okay, so something like E. coli would be a big one. So definitely bacteria, microorganisms like that, the things that cause typhoid fever, typhus, cholera, those things. And I guess the way that it was, the history of water treatment, which I think brought it home into those three buckets that I was talking about, is at first, like, anybody with a brain can see, oh, that's dirty water. I should probably get the dirt out before I drink it. And that was like step one. We got rid of the dissolved solids. We helped settle things out so we were drinking clear liquid. But then eventually we realized, oh, the liquid could be clear, but I could still get sick from that. And so that's where the microorganisms are like, oh, we should probably find a way to get rid of those. And that's where common disinfectants like chlorines and chloramines come in. They're added at the tail end of municipal water treatment before it goes to the pipes in your house. And the reason for that is once it leaves the water plant, it has to travel maybe miles to get to your home. And in that time, there's still dissolved organics that are in that water, and that can feed the bacteria and cause growth in the pipes. And when it gets to your house, you could be drinking something that could be harmful. And so they have to add that disinfectant and maintain a certain residual of that disinfectant in the pipes that they have to test at different points throughout the distribution network to ensure that, oh, we're not sending water that isn't chlorinated enough or water that's too chlorinated to your house. So sometimes if you're really near like a pumping station, you might end up with like, oh, my tap smells a little bit more like a pool water than my friend, a few blocks up, because you're getting that first dose, that redosing of chlorine in the distribution system, whereas as it has time to travel through the pipes, that chlorine is eaten up by killing those bugs, so to speak.
Oh,
and so then your friend down the street might have a less of a smell in your tap.
Interesting. So, this might not be a question that you can answer, but do you know, is there anything that stands out to you in municipal water treatment from the dissolved organic compound perspective that you think is harmful to plants, either in the treatment process or in the like the water that like the amounts that might be getting through?
Well, the chlorine stands out to me. Like if you have, because stuff that might be like it's safe for humans to drink, I think I looked it up before, the EPA's limit is like 4 parts per million of chlorine in water is the most it should be. And like for reference, you can start smelling like a pool chlorine odor at like 1 to 3 parts per million. And the most sensitive noses might even be like maybe half a part. But I don't really know, but I suspect that maybe concentrations that high may affect the plant more than they would us because it's a smaller organism, maybe less robust than we are. Although I don't want to make a blanket statement on plants calling them not robust, but just because of the size of the organism compared to us, stuff that's might be safe for humans to drink may not be for that plant to take in. And my analog there is that's definitely true for pets. And so that's why you'll see kind of an increased cancer rate in dogs and cats and things, because they're a much smaller organism. They weigh, a third, a fifth, whatever, a tenth of what we are. And so the limits on chemicals that we have that are safe for us may actually be harmful to them because they're a much smaller size.
Wow. I never thought of that. That's really kind of mind-blowing, honestly. So I know all the pet parents out there are like, oh man, maybe I need to add some additional filtering here.
That's the reason I got a Brita filter to begin with, is I wanted to make sure that, I could smell the chlorine in artesian water. And I was like, oh, well, maybe I should, fill my dog's bowl with something that's at least getting the disinfectant out, but still is good water for them. And now that's kind of what we drink in the house too.
So that brings up the thought for me of how do you remove chlorine, for example? I want to get to that a little bit later though. Before we touch on that, I want to say, giving you some of the kind of bonsai side of things, like we often talk about, or just in general in agriculture, we often talk about these kind of 17 essential elements for a plant. So that's like things that we fertilize, for example, like nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium, like NPK. I mean, you obviously are well versed in understanding those from a farming and plant growing perspective. And then, there's carbon and oxygen and hydrogen. And then there's kind of these micronutrients like sodium and magnesium and calcium and chlorine. Just like on the surface of it, when I look at my municipal water report, like there are a lot of those things in our tap water. Not as much the fertilizer components. I imagine we're trying to get that out of our water before we give it to people to drink, right? There's not a lot of like nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium to my understanding. But there can be there can be some like chlorine and calcium. So yeah, I'm curious, like hearing some of those element names, like does anything stand out to you in your experience with water treatment? And like, I guess for bonsai perspective, like what I really want to know is like, am I harming my plant or am I helping it whenever I'm giving it tap water, right? And obviously that depends on everyone's tap water, but for all I know, you could be fertilizing your plant every time you water it, or the opposite, you could be leading to its downfall, right? So that's kind of the hard thing in bonsai to know.
I imagine it is. Yeah, that sounds like quite the conundrum. The thing that I think about when I'm looking at reports like that is, a lot of that stuff's in the water, but I think in the notes that we had gone over before, it said something like, what's a meaningful concentration or what's there in a meaningful amount? Yeah. And my immediate question is meaningful to whom or meaningful to what? And so like those concentrations of, like I said, like we had mentioned with chlorine specifically, like concentrations that are meaningful to us or not meaningful to us, like, oh, it's safe for us to drink, might be meaningful to something else. And so when, like, I don't really know at what kind of concentrations you're targeting if you're trying to fertilize your plant, or like you're trying to reintroduce nutrients into your water source when you're watering your bonsai plant. I'm not as familiar with like, oh, my target concentration of phosphorus is this. My target concentration of nitrogen is this. And so I would recommend, if you're looking at your own personal like water quality report for where you are trying to make this kind of determination, is pay attention to what that concentration is and relative to what your goal is. That's kind of my biggest thing, is it might be there, but is it going to be meaningful to the plant? And I'm not exactly sure, because I'm not as big into bonsai, so I'm not really sure what those threshold concentrations are, but that would be my plan of it.
Yeah. When I went down this rabbit hole, what I tried to compare it to is, how do I find out what's meaningful? That's exactly the question I had. And my first thought was, why don't I look at the recommended dosage for fertilizer, right? Because that obviously is meaningful to the plant, and I know it has an impact. So whenever I use Miracle-Gro, they say use, 10 grams per liter or whatever, right? They give you a recommended concentration, and you can calculate like, hey, they give you the exact elemental analysis of your fertilizer, right? So they say it's, 12% nitrogen and 30% phosphorus. And I mean, they give you these molecules. They don't just give you the element, right? But you can back calculate like, hey, that's 200 ppm of nitrogen in my fertilizer or whatever, right? And from my kind of analysis of that, I guess the heuristic that I was looking at is like, whenever I mix up a gallon of Miracle-Gro, it's about 2,000 ppm, or like total dissolved solids reading is around 2,000. So my tap water, for example, is around 60. So to me, that tells me for the macronutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium, like those are not going to be in a range that's super impactful to the plant. But that then leads me to looking more closely at the micronutrients like magnesium and chlorine and calcium, right? And so I think I don't have the exact math in front of me right now, but I think those things are much more in the realm of potentially being meaningful, especially in how they might build up over time in the plant, in the soil system, right? Through continual watering. I think that approach makes sense. And I think it's something that we as hobbyists can look more closely into to understand relatively, like, hey, when my hardness is 300 versus when my hardness is 60, like those things have different meanings to the plant. Agreed. So, I mean, how the thing that was confusing to me though is like, we often, when I read a municipal water report, they're often reporting things in units of like hardness or calcium would be reported in units of like calcium carbonate, and I did,
Mhm.
or calcium bicarbonate, and I didn't really fully understand. Are they saying like it could be a mix of different things leading to this calcium content, but we're just going to report it in one like common compound that's available as like a standard? Or do you have
Generally,
more
yeah.
detail on what that means? So
That's
that might
that's
not
more
be
or
the
less it.
exact thing. Okay.
Now, what now I you're stretching my knowledge a little bit, and I had to do a little bit of research. But from what I understand, when you're measuring hardness, it's generally a mix of calcium bicarbonate or magnesium bicarbonate. Those are the two things, because when they're bound, what I read, they're bound up in the bicarbonate, and so they can be calculated or like determined from just boiling the water off. And basically, that's like an analog for how many other dissolved minerals are in the water. They're measuring the calcium and magnesium directly and using that as kind of a surrogate measure to see how much total stuff is in the water.
Okay.
Another, like a comparative thing, like another, like a related measure is the total dissolved solids, which will give you the measure for all the stuff, but it doesn't tell you anything about the makeup of it. And I've read in like a kind of a rule of thumb is if you take the total dissolved solids and divide by 10, that should give you kind of a rough measure of the calcium magnesium hardness. I don't know how that rule of thumb is determined. It's just something that I've picked up through experience and from reading. But so I don't know how, I don't know the veracity of that claim necessarily. But it's just kind of a neat comparison that the hardness is really calcium and magnesium is what they're measuring. But it's meant to be a representative number of how many total dissolved minerals are in the water, how much scale could build up.
Got it. So let's take one step back and talk a little bit about how are these different parameters measured to your knowledge. I guess maybe let's hit some of the top ones. Like we're obviously not going to be able to hit everything, but maybe like what's total dissolved solids, what's hardness, what's alkalinity, and what is dissolved organic compounds.
Okay.
Like maybe those four might be good. I mean, you tell me, or like pH, I guess maybe too. But
that works great.
Okay.
Let's start with the dissolved organic compounds is really a measure of when we say organic, we don't mean like organic chicken eggs. We mean organic, like carbon bonded to carbon. And that's really, it's taking, I believe they take it and actually take a sample of water and literally combust it to get a measurement of heat. And that's a representative of how much carbon is in that sample. And so that's meant to give you a measure of how, like the organic load in the water. So that would mean like how much chlorine, that could impact how much chlorine I need to add to the water in order to maintain my residual through my pipes. What's the potential for some of those chemicals being harmful in that big soup? Because I'm just measuring the total amount. I don't know the makeup of the organics that are in that compound or in that soup. Hardness is really a measure of the dissolved calcium and magnesium, dissolved metals kind of like that. Alkalinity is related to that. And this was a good question. I wasn't sure of this myself because they're near each other, alkalinity and hardness, but they tell you different things. So like the hardness is kind of the potential for scale, more or less, like it's dissolved minerals. So in theory, you could end up with scale on your pipes or like crust on your pans. Alkalinity is more a measure of buffering capacity. How resistant is the water to change in pH? And so generally higher alkalinity means it's going to, like, if you added a bunch of acid to that water, it's not going to change pH a whole lot. Lower alkalinity means it's going to be more sensitive to pH swings. So they're related because the alkalinity is measured in carbonate and bicarbonate. And hardness also shows in units of calcium bicarbonate. And so people will get those easily confused or conflated. But one's more about pH stability and one's more about dissolved minerals and scale buildup. And then dissolved solids would be kind of an analog to the dissolved organic compounds mixture that we were talking about. But instead of organic compounds, it's dissolved minerals, things like magnesium, calcium, other things like that.
How many electricity conducting ions are there in the water?
Yes, that's exactly right. Electrolytes, you could say. That might be a better way to put that.
In a bonsai context, we often talk about, like, there's a lot of research cited that says, hey, at certain pH ranges for your for your soil solution, the uptake of nutrients is better, right? So we're saying like if the pH is from, 5.5 to 6.5 or whatever it is, something in that range, then the nutrient uptake, like different dissolved components have different uptake rates into the plant based on pH, right? And it's not the pH of the water necessarily, it's the pH of the soil plus water. Whenever you water, you create a solution that's the equilibrium state of everything that's dissolved in the soil in these little particles that hold on to charged particles, as well as the water that you've added, right, to that solution. So those things form an equilibrium. And why I think alkalinity is relevant is because, what my question is, or the question that bonsai people ask is like, is my tap water impacting my soil solution pH, right? Because we want to target this specific pH, but you could have really low alkalinity water, like a low buffering capacity, and then potentially the soils and the dissolved components there are going to overpower, I guess is like my layman's way of saying it, the water. And so your water pH doesn't matter that much because the alkalinity is low, and so you can get into that optimal pH range that the soil naturally supports without too much problem, right? Mm-hmm. But the flip side of that is like, am I dropping things into my soil solution that will change the pH over time? And does the water have a high buffering capacity? So I don't know if I have a specific question for you, but just wanted to kind of lay out that that's like a question that we're asking in bonsai is like, and what I'm potentially taking away from it is like, hey, if we have higher alkalinity in our water, and we need to define what high alkalinity is, I guess, but if we have higher alkalinity, then we're more likely to need to have some remediation, right? Either filter our water or add acid to our water to reduce that pH to get into that optimal pH range. So I don't know, you don't have to have any comments on that, but that's just something that we ask and like think a lot about in bonsai.
Well, it's a really interesting framework. I definitely, you did a really good job explaining it for me, who's definitely a bonsai novice. I definitely understand the importance of that problem and trying to understand the effect of the water on the soil solution.
So something I wanted to dive into is like, obviously your core area of expertise is in activated carbon. And you talked to us about that being kind of a sponge for impurities or helping reduce these dissolved organic components of the water. Can you talk to us a little bit more about that? And then also, can you talk about any applications that you've had for activated carbon in like an agricultural space, if there are any, or any that you can think of based on what we've talked about so far about water and bonsai?
Yeah. Activated carbon, it acts like like you said, a good way to think about it is a sponge. And the reason it acts like that is as an enormous surface area. And so what makes it activated is you take a piece of carbonaceous material. It could be really anything that's made of carbon. One of our primary sources is usually bituminous coal or coconut shell, but it could be anything from wood, macadamia nuts, flaxseed, like hulls. Like they've tried to make anything into activated carbon, but you take that base structure and you activate it through either heat or a chemical process, and it basically eats away at some of the carbon and makes a carbon skeleton and makes a very, very porous, like 1,000 square meters per gram kind of surface area. So it gives it this huge surface area, but at a very small volume. And it's not the chemicals. You don't want to think of it as the chemicals like getting stuck in these little channels. Like they're not physically getting blocked in between two plates of carbon, but through like very localized, like London dispersion forces, the chemical is sticking to a sheet of carbon. And so if you're thinking about activated carbon, we kind of think of it as we would call it like a crude form of graphite. So if graphite is a bunch of sheets of carbon atoms stacked flat and uniform right on top of each other, activated carbon, like it's kind of like a brand new deck of playing cards is graphite. All the cards are uniform. They fit really nice in the package of the cards. But then activated carbon would be more like the deck of cards that you keep in the family trailer or at the lake house. They've had beer and juice spilled on them. The kids have bent them all over the place. So they're like kind of bulging and they don't all fit in that package anymore. And so there's space and a lot more space in between those sheets of carbon atoms. And so that's kind of how I like to visualize it. And it's in between those sheets that the atoms will, like the dissolved organic compounds, will stick to the carbon surface, but they're not actually getting wedged in between those playing cards, those carbon sheets. They're getting kind of pulled in like magnetism. But it's actually London dispersion forces, and I just remember that from when I was an application engineer. But I always thought of it as like a localized gravity magnetism. It's getting pulled in onto that carbon sheet.
Oh, very cool. So in bonsai, we sometimes put charcoal into our soil substrate, and I think into the actual soil mix that we use for bonsai. And I think the thought process there is kind of, well, I mean, I think there's twofold reasons. One is like our thought is like, hey, we're using these inorganic components for our soil, but plants rely on relationships with organic molecules like different, I don't know, fungi and bacteria and microbes or whatever that, help with nitrification and like all these different processes that the plant goes through, right? Or breaking down organic fertilizer components into their parts that are then accessible to the plant, right? So there's all these different bacteria that do that. And so our thought process is we've got this really small container and it's a lot of inorganic components. So if we add charcoal, we're adding more sites for the plant to be able to have those bacteria that will kind of supercharge those different processes. So that's one reason. And I think the other reason might be that like there's potentially additional cation exchange capacity that we're giving to the soil so it can hold on to charged particles. Thus we can hold more fertilizer in the soil and there's more available to the plant. So I'm wondering, like hearing those things, how much of that sounds like baloney, and like how is charcoal different than activated carbon?
It's not a whole lot different. It's really different in that it's a very, very crude peak form of activated carbon because it's made not to remove or like purify things. It's made for a different purpose, but it's made in a very similar process to activated carbon. It's heating it up in the absence of oxygen to make those little briquettes. It looks very similar to activated carbon, but it's different. It's softer. It doesn't sound like it's a whole lot of baloney. That sounds like a lot of the same things that activated carbon would do. Like it definitely has some ion exchange properties because of the surface chemistry on it. And so that's not, on the face of it, that's not a whole lot of baloney. And there's a whole region of activated carbon use in drinking water treatment, but also in like wastewater reuse treatment, where there's biological activated carbon, where they actually use activated carbon as a biological substrate. They leave activated carbon online, like way beyond its useful life for removing organics into its structure, but they use it specifically to grow bacteria that will eat the bulk organics that are coming in. So in a wastewater treatment stream, the organic load is enormous, and it would eat through a bed of carbon in a very short period of time relative to like municipal drinking water. But one way around that is, okay, it's going to eat through the carbon's capacity, but you could grow bacteria on that bed that can eat that organic matter a lot more efficiently than it could be removed by carbon. And so in those situations, people are actively growing bugs on a carbon bed. And so what you're saying, like, oh, having more sites or more room for bacteria in your soil substrate by adding charcoal is, in a way, kind of doing the same thing. So it doesn't sound like a whole lot of baloney. That sounds like that might be a pretty good idea. Depends on kind of a cost-benefit analysis. I'd think, like, is that more expensive than other soil substrates in bonsai? And if so, like, what's the benefit? And does the benefit, like, are you actually able to see an improvement in your plant's health and well-being? Are you able to, I'm like, I don't even know how you would measure that. So, like, I would defer to you on, like,
exactly.
Was my plant happy? Like, am I improving the soil chemistry enough to make it do better? Like, those are all questions that I would have that seem really interesting. But on the face of it, no, those sound like legitimate mechanisms. They don't sound foolish to me.
Yeah, and I think the challenge in bonsai is that, how do you ensure that the organic ecosystem in the soil is actually full of positive bacteria and things like that, as opposed to negative? Like, it's hard, like, we don't really know how to measure that or control that, right? So, but it is something that some people use as a, like, maybe it's only 5% of their soil medium or something like that. They're not using massive amounts of it, but it is something that people do. That's good. That's good to know, though, that like that hypothesis is potentially true. And I think we'd have to look at more agricultural specific research to say, like, hey, this marijuana grow operation or this farm started adding carbon into their soil medium and saw these different results, right? You'd have to like measure yield over time or something like that. It's probably hard to do that kind of testing at a bonsai scale, where you might only have like 10 of the same plant or something like that.
I haven't done anything. I haven't worked in it myself. I've been exclusively in the drinking water market at Calgon, but I know that there are soil amendment applications where people are trying to add charcoal or activated carbon to their soil to improve the health of their plants. And I know that like I kind of do something similar just in my own composting. Like I'll take the ash from my fire and put it in and mix it in with the compost and all of the other organic stuff just to kind of get a healthy mix of carbon in there with the other nutrients that I'm adding from the bananas peels that I'm throwing away. And so I think
interesting.
Activated carbon, like whilst people are doing that, like I'm doing that incidentally, but people are trying to do that more intentionally. So yeah.
So what for, like you mentioned that you use a filter at home, for example, on your water, like that kind of brings up for me, like what is a recommended way, or what do you see people doing to filter their tap water? Like what kind of systems do they have and what kind of outputs are they aiming for? I've seen like in bonsai, some people will use RO systems, and I'm just curious, like what components do you think make sense in terms of like, should you have a activated carbon stage? Should you have just a reverse osmosis filter? Like what kind of components would you say make up a kind of home water treatment setup in your experience?
Well, they vary. Generally, they can be reverse osmosis. They could be a multi-stage filter that has different media in it, not just activated carbon, but a combination of different media to target different things. Since activated carbon is really the workhorse for dissolved organics, but there could be metals and other things in the water that you want to remove. So something like an ion exchange resin. That's pretty common in I guess, let me take a step back and break it up into two different categories. There's usually like point of entry systems, which would be something like where the water comes into your house. There would be something like a tank system that you get from the Calgon guy, like Calgon or some other like water treatment, water softening company would come in and install a system that's, might have tanks that are 6 feet high, about your height, and in your basement, treating the water that's coming into your house so that everything that's going to every tap in your house is the same quality. But then there are also point of use systems, and that's something that might be under your sink or on your countertop or in your fridge that's just treating the water at that specific point that you're using, just on the kitchen tap or just at the fridge. And so the technologies differ between those two things. And I work at Calgon Carbon, and so obviously our interest is activated carbon. And so we sell the activated carbon that go into those systems, but we don't build those systems ourselves. So my range of knowledge on exactly how each one works is a little bit limited. Which one is the most useful or best for you is a choice, is like a person-to-person, place-to-place choice. There are different pros and cons to each one. To me, the activated carbon and like the point of use like filter is the simplest one. It's the easiest to get to. So it's like you get a big benefit for not a lot of work. And so to me, that's really appealing. I'm very simple, like biggest bang for your buck kind of guy. But depending on where you live and what your interests are and how sensitive, maybe you have, very particular things about you or particular medical issues, or just very sensitive. Your skin's really sensitive to certain things, like a reverse osmosis system might be the most appropriate. The pros and cons is when you have a reverse osmosis system, you're getting everything out, but that means like you have basically deionized water left over. And so you might need to reintroduce things into the water to make it taste better, or actually not like dehydrate you and strip you of all of your electrolytes too. And you have a waste stream that you have to deal with. And again, I'm stepping out of my comfort zone. I don't really know a whole lot, but there's generally some sort of waste stream left over that you then have to process. Like anything, you'll have to change the filter or the membranes out with the reverse osmosis system, similar to how you would a Brita filter type system.
Yep, makes sense. Okay, yeah, that makes sense, and I think that's a good summary. I actually didn't even know about the point of entry type systems, so that's good to know about. If I ever buy a house, maybe I'll do something like that. But luckily, in San Francisco, we actually have very good water, which is nice. So we don't have to deal with that as much. But it's definitely a topic that's really fascinated me. All right, the other thing I was wondering is, at the beginning of the call, you got me thinking about chlorine and chloramines. Well, first of all, what's the difference between those two things? I mean, I'm guessing they're both those components that are used to treat the like from the facility to your house organic components that might be growing. But like, what's the difference between those two? And then how do you get rid of it?
All right. So chlorine is it's chlorine generally added as hypochlorite or bleach to the water. And that's like the original disinfectant. That's what started it all. The issue that you can run into with that is that we mentioned all those dissolved organic compounds that we talked about. It's a big soup of organic stuff, carbon bonded to carbon, a whole bunch of different molecules. Well, when that's in the water and you dose it with chlorine, you can end up with what we call disinfection byproducts, or DBPs, is you'll see it in like the EPA documents, disinfection byproducts. And that's like, those are known harmful chlorinated chemicals that result when you dose chlorine into water with some dissolved organic chemicals in them. And so there are regulations on, okay, well, you have to dose chlorine and you have to have a certain residual in your pipes. But at the same time, you're fighting a battle of, okay, I can't exceed the limit of disinfection byproducts that are in the water. So I can't just dose the heck out of my water with chlorine, because then I'm going to have a bunch of carcinogens in the water that I have to deal with. The kind of the way around that, or the clever way that some people came up with, is to use chloramines, which is chlorine and ammonia mixed together to form chloramine, nitrogenous chlorine. And that chemical will not form the same disinfection byproducts that are regulated by the EPA. The disinfection byproducts that are regulated by the EPA are total trihalomethanes. So basically a methane that has 3 different halogens on it, basically chlorine. And then, what's the other one? Son of a gun, I'm going to have to look it up now.
I'm going to tell you, 99% of the folks listening won't know.
They're tuned out now. Excellent.
No, I meant...
the point is that you're not forming the regulated chemicals. You're not forming those disinfection byproducts by using the chloramine. And so you can dose the disinfection and make sure you're getting the proper residual without exceeding that maximum contaminant limit for those disinfection byproducts.
Got it.
The trade-off is
the byproducts of that are not carcinogenic also, but yeah.
There's research into that, and there's more stuff coming, I'm sure, in the regulatory sphere around that. That's been a question for the last 10 years since I've been working at Calgon. That's been a topic of discussion. It's like, hey, we're not forming these ones that we know are harmful, but what are we forming? Like, are there other consequences to that?
Makes sense. And then for a home user, like, how do you get this stuff how do you get chlorines or chloramines or disinfectant byproducts out of your, like, let's say we found research that the chlorine was in levels that are harmful to plants, though it is a necessary micronutrient, there's probably too much of it, right? So we need to, there could be too much of it. So we need to like define whether it's a meaningful amount or not first, right? But let's say there was a meaningful amount, like what type of, like, is that where you have a stage with carbon or a DI resin on your home filter, and that's where you get rid of that? Or
yes,
what's the
carbon is going to be the most efficient in my experience, because the carbon and the chlorine will go through a redox reaction, and the carbon, I believe, is the reducing agent. You'll grill me on this later. Roast me in the comments, as they say. But chlorine isn't adsorbed by carbon. It's not like going into the pore space of the activated carbon, but it's reacting to the surface chemistry of the carbon, and they're breaking each other down. And so the chlorine will basically it will be broken down, but the carbon will also be broken down a little bit. It'll start turning to mush, basically, but it's going to take a long time for the carbon to turn to mush. It's a very efficient, very fast reaction. So carbon blocks or carbon filter is a great way to get chlorine out of the water. Chloramines are a little bit harder to get rid of. The reaction takes a longer period of time. So the traditional carbon isn't necessarily as effective for removing chloramines as compared to chlorine itself. There are certain surface chemistry things you can do to the activated carbon to make it more effective to remove those chloramines. You can add hydroxyl groups to the surface of the carbon to make it a little bit more, reactive to it. So it will oxidize the chloramines more efficiently. But you would need a more specialized carbon to be effective at those kinds of things.
Okay.
But a
So
traditional
the
carbon
types
just kind of does it.
got it. Like my home RO system that I actually don't use for bonsai, but I was using for my fish tank, was like an RODI system, and it had, I think, 4 stages, and it had reverse osmosis. It had like a inline sediment filter. It had a carbon filter, and it had a DI filter. And like, it seems like those 4 stages account for, I mean, the water coming out of my tap or out of the system is, 0 total dissolved solids. So it's getting pretty much everything, as I'm assuming.
Oh,
But
yeah.
it sounds like for bonsai, those components, those kind of stages make sense. And I'm glad that we got more insight into like what's actually going on within that carbon filter component and why it's important within those systems. So I appreciate you kind of sharing more detail on that.
Well, thank you. Well, thanks for letting me.
So we talked. No, for sure. This has been super fun. I've learned a lot. I don't want to push too hard on like the trying to figure out solutions to some of the common bonsai problems. We've talked about a lot of them, and I think as bonsai hobbyists, we now have a lot more to research and a lot more of a foundation. But one thing I kind of wanted to, there's a few things that I wanted to kind of run by you, and no problems if you don't know the answers. But yeah, something we commonly see is like we have high pH in our water. Do we need to reduce it or not? Like that's still kind of up for grabs. But I've seen people like add acids, like acetic acid or something like that, inject it into their water stream as it comes out of the pipes. That seems to work to lower to the pH. And I'm assuming that then has the similar effect in the actual container where, the water coming in is a lower pH and then it's forming a solution with the soil and probably has a lower pH solution in the soil as well. I don't know if I have a specific question on that, but like, does that seem like that system of reducing, like assuming with the assumption that a lower pH is better or like a specific pH is better for the soil system, do you see any downsides to that system, or that seems like adding acid is a fair way to reduce the high alkaline, high pH water?
I mean, generally, that's like how you're going to bring the pH down is add acid to something that's high.
Okay.
pH. I guess my question would be is like, are they doing that? Like, is the water that's coming out of that stream, is it like going right in, like, is it like they're adding acid like directly into their hose and spraying the plant, or is it going into a container and then the container is sitting and they use that container later to like water the plant? Because my concern would be like the precise application of how much acid, like how, like to me that would be hard for me. Like I would think like it's going to be hard to control, and I'm not going to be able to get the water coming out of my hose to the exact pH that I want if I'm targeting a very specific pH for the plant. I would think that doing some sort of batch operation, like having a container of water and knowing what the pH is, or like I can then measure what the alkalinity, the buffering capacity, I can measure all the stuff that I want and get a reasonable reading that whole container is the same. It's uniform. And so then I can add a precise amount of acid to get it exactly where I want it. If it's just doing it on the fly as it's coming out of the hose, like, yeah, your water quality report says the pH is this, or like you just tested it. But as you run it over time, that pH could change slightly just from running it through the tap. It feels like that would be harder to control. So like my immediate thought was like, oh, I'm going to batch this. Like I'm going to get the water into some container so that I can measure it as a whole and then know exactly what I need to put into it to get it to where I want.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, for bonsai, I've almost 100% seen it be like inline. So people have a like concentrate bucket and they have a system called like a dosatron typically, but it's just like an inline injection system, and it, kind of pipettes, small amounts out of the concentrate into the stream of water, and they'll just measure it like, hey, I mix up my concentrate and I measure the pH coming out of the hose end, and then if it's what I want, then I'm good. But can you talk a little bit more about how much does water parameters vary, like day to day, week to week, month to month? Like how much does the treatment process vary, and how much does the actual water parameters vary in your experience?
It's tough for me to quantify exactly how much, but like I know that like when you're reading your water quality report at the end of the year and it tells you like, oh, your total trihalomethanes or haloacetic acids was the other disinfection byproduct.
You got it.
I knew I'd get it. But like those are all like they have to take sample. They're not taking samples continuously for those things. They're only sampling them like once every quarter. or like every couple of weeks. And so in between there can be variability. And I'm not saying that utilities do this, but they could play games with how they do their system and when they take their sample. Like, oh, I know that I've been using chloramines for a while. And so because there's nitrogen in that mixture, as you send it through the pipe, the chlorine gets eaten up and there's nitrogen left over. And that's really good food for bacteria. And so you can end up with biofilm growth in your pipes. And that can end up with not good measurements when you go to take them to the distribution system. So what people will end up doing is they can turn off the nitrogen feed for a while and just smoke the heck out of the pipes with just pure chlorine for like 2 weeks right before they take the sample. And so then they could end up with results that look good, but it might not be representative of what it is as a whole. And again, I'm not accusing any utility of doing that. I'm just saying that in theory, you could potentially do that and play games so that your samples that you have to take and submit all look good, but it may not be representative of what's happening all the time. And so that having that kind of framework makes me think like it can vary up and down, maybe like 1.5 points on pH if I had to guess. And so with stuff like that, like it would make, maybe it's my own personality, but it just makes me feel more warm and fuzzy to be like, okay, I know this batch of water is what it is. It's not going to change over time a whole lot. And in reality, it might not change a whole lot in that inline system because everybody's doing it that way. Someone could conclude that because everyone's doing it that way and there hasn't been a really big downside that it might be effective and there's not a whole lot of variability. But I would wonder about that just because I know that water, like you could have in well water, it's not as big, but in surface water in particular, like the temperature seasonally changes. You could end up with wildly different results like 2 weeks apart just because the temperature dropped and the lake bed like flipped, like the water table just
or maybe they even
changed.
Get water from a different source.
Yep.
It really can depend on the utility and the information. That makes a lot of sense. I think that's one point towards with the RO systems. People like you can't get the flow rate out of an RO system from a hose and to just water continuously, right? You have to build a tank and then you use that tank with another pump that you attach to your hose system, right? So with that system, you have much more knowledge of what exactly you're doing, right? And then the downside, I guess, is that you've created this water that's stripped of everything. And so you might need to add some stuff back in, right? Just like you add fertilizer, for example. See, the thing with fish tanks, for example, you have to take like for saltwater fish tanks, they're fish are very, just like you were saying earlier about the chemicals in the water are good for humans to drink, but they can be at concentrations that are harmful to much smaller organisms. Exactly the same way with fish tanks. And so you have to take out everything, go down to 0 total dissolved solids with a RODI system. And then you build it back up by taking like salt mixtures essentially and remaking salt water, right? And then you give it to the fish and they're happy. But with bonsai, I think we suffer a little bit less challenge from that because like we're already fertilizing the plants. So we're adding fertilizers, which, would dissolve in the water and change the makeup of the water. So those fertilizers potentially are pretty complete systems. Hopefully they've been designed that way to have all the macronutrients and micronutrients that the plant needs to the best of our knowledge, right? If the fertilizer is built to have the right amount, then you would just mix in your inorganic fertilizer and go to town. And you wouldn't have to add additional supplemental nutrients. Yeah. So last thing I wanted to touch on was what I'll kind of call the container effect. So I think that and I'm wondering if you can kind of validate this kind of mental model that I have or see if it passes the sniff test for the buildup of stuff in our pot from watering. So when we water, we saturate the soil volume. Then whenever the soil volume is saturated, extra water that you're putting into the system rushes out of the drainage holes at the bottom. We always have drainage holes in bonsai, right? So there's always an exchange of water that's coming in and coming out. But like whenever you stop watering, you have this saturated volume of soil, right? So there's all the stuff that was in the tap water mixing with all the stuff that's in the soil. And then, those components either get pulled up into the plant or the water, I guess, evaporates, right? And so when that happens, there's stuff that was in the water that didn't get taken into the plant that is deposited in the soil, right? So
Yeah.
when you then water again, some amount of that will be leached, right? If you're building up these high concentrations of things, some amount of that stuff that you put in will mix with the water and then come out the drainage hole.
Yeah, it'll dissolve again.
Yeah, so you do have some degree of leaching where there's some degree of like buildup in the soil mass is resolved through continual watering and like this irrigation process, right? But potentially, like that equilibrium that's reached is going to be impacted by how much stuff is in the water. So if you have a lot of stuff in your water, then you're going to build up a lot of stuff in your soil, right? Like up to the amount that's in the water, right?
Yep.
And so something I've been thinking about is, should you water with periods of like pure water, like RO water periodically to try to leach out? Or like, you know, if you get natural rain, that will probably leach out components more quickly. But I'm wondering like, what do they do for municipal plants where like stuff builds up over time whenever you've got these like cycles? What kind of stuff do they do for like hardness buildup in municipal plants? And then do you think that mental model of how I've described like the buildup of components from your tap water in your soil makes sense?
The way that you describe the buildup of minerals and stuff on the soil from the tap water makes entire sense. I followed all of that. From the municipal standpoint, so I'm not in the municipal plant. From when I've been in the municipal plants, a lot of times they're using, chelating agent to make sure that the stuff like that will stay in solution, so it's not destroying their equipment over time. But also the first stage of the plant is trying to drop out as many solids as possible. When the dirt comes in, it goes like you're adding coagulants to the water right away. And so it's taking as many of the suspended solids and dissolved solids and trying to get the dissolved solids to kind of clump together so it forms a suspended solid. And then the next step is to hopefully those get heavy enough to then drop to the bottom of the water, and then you have clean water left over. You run that clean water through the sediment filter to get whatever's left. And then hopefully through activated carbon so that you can purchase it from my company to remove the dissolved organic contaminants from the water, and then hit it with the disinfectant. The scale buildup that would occur is usually happening in the pipes in the distribution system, just because it has the most time in the pipes. The time, like the actual resonance time of like any unit of water that's going through the water plant isn't all that long. And so you don't have I would think you don't have as much scale buildup in the plant because the water is moving more quickly than it is in the pipes, where it could be sitting stagnant waiting to come into your house. But they're usually using some sort of agent to keep that stuff in solution until it gets out of the plant when it has time to kind of sit out there.
Okay. Makes sense.
But that's a really interesting question of, should you use pure water to reset your soil, like your soil mixture, your whatever you call it? Because I know it's not usually dirt or whatever. So I don't know how to properly say the stuff that the bonsai plant is in.
Yeah.
That's fine. So that's a really interesting thought experiment. I would have to sit with that for a while, but I think you'd have to look at what your water is relative to what you want your plant to be getting. And it's is my equilibrium, is the theoretical equilibrium that I would reach, is that going to be eventually, is that going to be harmful to the plant? Is it going to be too much of something if I keep adding it over time? Or no, my equilibrium for my water, if I'm depositing stuff, it's likely to be okay for the plant. That's kind of where my head's going.
So you're saying you do a fresh repotting and you have fresh soil from the ground with your tree, and I'm adding water every day to that, right? And so over time, the components in the soil will change somewhat to reach an equilibrium with the water that you're feeding to the tree, right? Mm-hmm. And so you're saying my thought was if you add pure water, then you're reducing that buildup over time, right?
Yes.
Which I think is fairly fair thing to say. You add the water, if it's pure, it's going to pull more stuff out of the soil, and then it comes out the drainage hole, and there's less stuff in the total volume of stuff in the soil, right? But you're saying hey, you have to also verify are you solving a problem that is actually a problem? Is the equilibrium that your tap water reaches with your soil harmful or not? If it is, maybe adding pure water would reduce it somewhat and hold off that equilibrium. But if it is harmful, there might be a better way to solve that. Why aren't you using pure water every time, right? Why don't you have a filtration system or something like that? So yeah, that is an interesting kind of thought process.
Yeah, and I don't know if it's like knowable to know, like, can you determine what, like, I imagine it would take a lot of work to figure out, like, oh, what's the equilibrium level of my soil? Like, if I water with pure water, like, how much of a leaching effect am I actually getting with that one container or unit of water that I'm pouring? Would I need to use like 10, or would I need to water like 10 or 12 times to reset that soil effectively? Or am I just kind of making myself feel good thinking, yeah, I'm resetting the soil, but it's not actually getting the effect that you think it is? Like, there are lots of questions that come into my head that are really interesting things that I want to try to figure out. But I feel like each one of those would take a lot of individual work to try to figure out too. But I
Yeah,
think that's
absolutely.
part of what makes bonsai fun, is that
Exactly.
there's so many avenues to go down and like ways to explore how this goes. Like, this feels like a really fun kind of engineering problem.
Yeah. Well, Eric, I really appreciate you taking the time. This was a blast of a conversation for me, and I think illuminated a lot of things. So I really appreciate you researching and then also just sharing your expertise with us. Is there anything that came up for you or that you want to kind of close out with, or?
No, I mean, I want to say thank you for having me on. I don't get to talk as much about like water treatment and activated carbon in like a pseudo public setting anymore. That was a big part of my job for a while, and I came to enjoy it. So getting to talk and just have a conversation with someone about this stuff and learn new things through a conversation is kind of fun for me. And I didn't realize that until I came to see you last year in San Francisco. Really getting to sit down and talk with you and getting to rekindle our friendship a little bit just made me realize how much fun these kind of conversations could be. So I really, really do appreciate that. I do wonder, just, you're coming to me for this water advice, and I'm flattered. But I wonder if like there are other industries that you could be looking at too. And the one that like jumped to my head is, because you mentioned it earlier, is like marijuana. Like, a lot of the industrial growers are doing it hydroponically, and so those plants are getting all of their nutrients from water in kind of the same way that bonsai is getting a lot of their nutrients from the way you're watering. So I wonder if there's ways to learn from stuff that's being done commercially in that industry that might lend itself to bonsai.
Yeah, I would love to speak to somebody in that industry. We actually, I'm adding one more question because you mentioned it. We often talk about like how close is bonsai to hydroponics. We use this
Mm,
really, we use this really, like, we do have soil, and I mean, I actually don't fully understand hydroponics, but my intuition or my thought was that it's like they're growing it fully in water, but that could be incorrect. But in in bonsai, we do have soil, right? But
mm,
it's very inorganic. There's massive pore space compared to like a regular soil. So there's a lot of like air in the soil. And then the tree, the inorganic soil mix doesn't really have any like of the main essential nutrients that the plant needs. So we have to add all of those via fertilizer, right? Either an inorganic or an organic fertilizer, a dissolved fertilizer or like a liquid or physical. And so people have often said that bonsai is very, very close to hydroponics, which I kind of prescribe to. But I'm wondering if you have any intuition of like, I mean, maybe this is a question for somebody in the hydroponics industry, but I'm wondering if you have any intuitions on like how close to hydroponics our systems would be.
that was like, that was my first thought when I was like reading through some of the outline you had sent me to try to look at this stuff. Like, that was one thing that jumped out at me, was like, oh, this does seem like kind of similar, because in the way that you described bonsai when I visited you, was that the soil is really kind of, it's like holding the plant in place, and it's like substrate to hold nutrients from the water. And so like I was like, oh well, hydroponics, the plants are basically getting all of their nutrients from the water. And Liz actually just got like a little like herb garden hydroponic thing that's sitting in our basement, and so she just cut up a bunch of fresh dill that she grew from seeds from Christmas. And so like I'm gonna have to take that thing apart and see, because it does start with a tiny little bit of soil, but then the underbed is constantly like circulating water. Um,
Interesting.
and so there's a very, very tiny amount of soil, but I don't actually know how much, and like how much the root structure is in the soil versus like it's really just sitting in the water. And I'll ask Liz, and I'll send something to you, because she just, like she did, she just harvested it today. So she probably has an idea of, oh, this was just like, I just pulled this stalk out and it was sitting in, like, it's just soaking wet. So that's an interesting thought. But that, like, I would, off the cuff, I would say they seem really similar. I don't know how much bonsai purists would like that answer, but to me, it seems like a pretty close analog.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's great advice. If anybody listening, if you have a connection with someone who you think would be interesting to talk to, also my neighbor here is a cannabis shop. So maybe I can walk in there and just ask them, like, hey, where do you get your stuff from?
Hey, that's something to do,
see if they
man.
know any hydroponic facilities. So, okay, Eric, I really appreciate you taking the time. Thank you so much. If folks have questions, I guess I'll kind of forward them on to you. I know you don't have a bonsai Instagram or something like that, but if anything comes in for you, it's another excuse for me to chat with you. So,
oh, please. And if there are any fun comments roasting me, I want to hear about them. I like to laugh at myself. The older I get, the more I like to laugh at myself. So please, no mercy, roast me.
Usually we don't get too much heckling, but it should be okay. All right. Well, thank you so much, Eric. Have a good night. And yeah, really looking forward to hearing folks' thoughts on this and like what kind of comes to people's minds after listening to it. I think this is a eye-opening conversation. So thank you.
Thank you for having me.